What would you think if I told you that one of America's most beloved entertainers built his legend not on charm alone, but on silence, denial, and a carefully curated lie the world still refuses to confront? Dean Martin was never just a singer. He was a symbol. A relaxed smile wrapped around a whiskey glass, a voice that sounded like it had never been touched by fear. To generations, he represented ease in a post-war America desperate to believe that success came without consequence. But that image, smooth, invincible, eternally amused, was not innocence. It was armor. And this story is about what that armor hid, why it was rewarded, and what it cost everyone else. The thesis at the heart of this story is simple and unsettling. Dean Martin's legend survived because the system needed him to remain uncomplicated. His darkness was not exposed. It was protected. Not because it wasn't there, but because acknowledging it would have fractured the fantasy America was addicted to. Picture him on stage in the early 1960s. The spotlight warm, the audience already laughing before he speaks. He slurs slightly, jokes about being drunk, lets the crowd believe they're in on something naughty. But the drunkenness is mostly theater. The looseness is rehearsed. What looks like rebellion is actually compliance. He plays the role of the carefree white man so perfectly that no one asks what happens when the curtain drops. Behind that curtain was a man deeply entangled with power structures most fans never wanted to examine. Mob connections weren't rumors whispered in dark corners. They were open secrets. Contracts, venues, protection. The same criminal networks that terrorized communities were quietly shaping entertainment empires. Dean Martin didn't challenge that system. He benefited from it. And the world rewarded his silence with safety, wealth, and myth. Now pause here and ask yourself why that silence was tolerated. Ask why other artists, especially black artists of the same era, were punished for far less. When Sammy Davis Jr. dared to step outside the lines, the backlash was immediate and violent. When black performers spoke about control, ownership, or dignity, they were labeled difficult. Dean Martin, meanwhile, could coast through associations with organized crime and still be framed as harmless fun. That contrast is not accidental. It reveals the racial math. This is the first dark truth the world avoids. Dean Martin's image was not just personal branding, it was racial privilege performing relaxation. He could appear disengaged, even careless, because the system was designed to catch him when he fell. Others were, there's a scene insiders still talk about. A private recording session, late at night. Martin, alone, no audience, no Rat Pack banter. The voice is still beautiful, but the ease is gone. Between takes, the jokes stop. He stares at the floor longer than necessary. Someone asks if he wants to keep going. He shrugs. Indifference masquerading as strength. But indifference, over time, becomes its own prison. You're told he didn't care, that nothing bothered him. But that narrative serves a purpose. Because if he truly didn't care, then no one has to ask what he avoided feeling, or why emotional withdrawal became his most consistent habit, not just from fans, but from his children, his marriages, his own inner life. This leads to another truth rarely spoken aloud. Dean Martin mastered absence. He survived by and the world refuses to accept these truths not because they're false, but because they destabilize the fantasy that some men glide through fame untouched. Dean Martin didn't float above the darkness. He was shielded from consequence by a culture invested in keeping him. And that protection, that insulation from truth, is not harmless nostalgia. It is a blueprint. One that explains who gets forgiven, who gets erased, and who is never allowed to fall without being destroyed. The smile was real, the voice was real. But the myth was a collaboration, and the cost of that collaboration still echoes. The second truth unfolds not on a stage, but in the quiet violence of control. How Dean Martin's career thrived by never threatening the hands that fed it. There is a moment, often romanticized, when Martin breaks from Jerry Lewis. The public version frames it as creative exhaustion, two titans parting ways to find their individual destinies. But behind that narrative was something more uncomfortable. Martin's deliberate choice to detach from chaos rather than confront it. Where Lewis was volatile, demanding, unpredictable, qualities the system punishes, Martin was calm, agreeable, and strategically distant. He didn't fight the machine. He learned how to glide alongside it. This is where the thesis sharpens. Dean Martin survived because he never tried to own himself completely. He allowed institutions, studios, casinos, mob-backed venues, television networks, to shape the boundaries of his identity. In return, he was spared the violence reserved for artists who demand autonomy. Look at his transition into television. The Dean Martin Show was a masterclass in containment. Loose, improvised, seemingly rebellious, yet meticulously controlled. Guests rotated through with rehearsed spontaneity. Racial tensions of the era were neutralized with jokes. Political unrest stayed outside the studio doors. Black artists could appear, but only within safe, smiling limits. The show didn't challenge America, it reassured it. And reassurance is power. While the country burned, civil rights marches met with batons, assassinations shattering illusions, Dean Martin remained untouched by urgency. He did not speak. He did not take a stand. His silence was interpreted as neutrality, but neutrality is never neutral when the system already favors you. It becomes endorsement through absence. You're invited to ask a harder question here. Was this ignorance, or was it calculation? Because silence, when consistently rewarded, becomes strategy. Martin understood something many artists never had the luxury to learn, that emotional disengagement could be monetized, that by never fully revealing belief, pain, or conviction, one could remain universally palatable. He became a blank screen onto which America projected ease, while others were forced to carry meaning they never asked for. This is the third dark truth the world avoids. Dean Martin's coolness was not freedom. It was compliance perfected. There's a chilling anecdote from a Vegas residency. A black performer, early in their career, watches Martin glide through the casino floor. Security parting crowds, owners nodding deferentially. Later that night, the same performer is warned not to linger in certain areas. Same building, same audience, different rules. Martin never comments. He doesn't need to. His silence keeps the hierarchy intact, and yet, privately, cracks form. Alcohol, once a prop, becomes a companion. Distance hardens, relationships thin out. When his son Dean Paul dies in a plane crash, the grief is seismic, but almost entirely hidden. The public sees stoicism. What they don't see is the emotional cost of a lifetime spent avoiding confrontation with pain. When grief finally arrives, there are no muscles trained to hold it. This reveals the fourth truth. Emotional avoidance does not eliminate suffering. It delays it, concentrates it, and turns it inward. Martin's detachment protected him from scandal, but it also isolated him from intimacy. Fame didn't wound him the way it wounded others because he never fully entered it as a vulnerable self. But the price of that insulation was a slow erasure of interior life. By the end, the man who once embodied ease seemed to drift through rooms like a ghost of his own myth. And here, the story folds back on itself. Because the same system that rewarded his silence now depended on it. To question Dean Martin too deeply would mean questioning why other artists were destroyed for far less. It would mean admitting that charisma without resistance is safer than genius with demands, that the world prefers icons who never force it to grow. So the truths remain buried. The mob connections reframed as colorful folklore. The emotional absence rewritten as charm. the silence during history's loudest moments labeled class. But history remembers differently when looked at closely. Dean Martin wasn't evil. He wasn't a villain. He was something more unsettling. Proof that survival inside a corrupted system often requires becoming emotionally invisible. And invisibility, when celebrated, teaches the next generation a dangerous lesson, that staying quiet is the price of staying safe. The world refuses to accept this because it threatens the fantasy of effortless success. Because it asks whether likability is sometimes just obedience with better lighting. And once that question is asked, the smile starts to crack. By the final act of Dean Martin's life, the legend had outlived the man, and that is the fifth and most uncomfortable truth the world resists. Because when the laughter faded and the lights dimmed, what remained was not triumph, but quiet withdrawal. The man who once filled rooms without effort began to disappear from them. Performances shortened, public appearances thinned, interviews became rare. The same detachment that once read as effortless cool now felt like exhaustion. Not dramatic collapse, just erosion. This is where the mythic documentary becomes clearest, not in scandal, but in absence. Martin did not fall the way other icons fell. There was no public reckoning, no televised disgrace, no symbolic punishment. And that precisely is the point. His legacy proves that the system does not destroy everyone equally. Some are broken loudly as warnings. Others are allowed to fade quietly, so the fantasy remains intact. And here is where the story must be placed back into its cultural context. Dean Martin was not a black icon, but his survival exposes the machinery that made being a black icon so punishing. While black artists were forced to carry the weight of representation, protest, and visibility, often at the cost of their safety, Martin was permitted to be undefined, to be charming without explanation, to exist without confrontation. His whiteness did not make him evil, it made him protected. This is not about guilt. It is about structure. Because when you look closely, Dean Martin's life becomes a negative image of black celebrity experience. Where black artists were hyper-visible, Martin was allowed opacity. Where black pain was consumed as spectacle, his pain was edited out. Where black resistance was criminalized, his silence was rewarded. So when the world refuses to accept the darker truths about Dean Martin, it is not just protecting him. It is protecting the story it tells itself about fairness, merit, and innocence. You're invited now to sit with that discomfort. Because it asks something difficult of the viewer, not whether Dean Martin was good or bad, but why goodness and badness were never the metrics applied to him in the first place. Why charm outweighed accountability? Why comfort mattered more than truth? In his final years, those close to him describe a man who watched old tapes in silence, performances replayed like echoes, the voice still there, but the body less interested in being seen. The world remembered the image. The image no longer needed the man. And this is the quiet violence of fame when it is built on evasion. Not explosion, but disappearance. The legacy, however, remains powerful precisely because it is unresolved. Dean Martin endures as a symbol of what happens when an artist aligns perfectly with the emotional needs of a dominant culture. He becomes untouchable, and untouchable figures rarely get examined, they get preserved. But preservation is not truth. Truth is messier. Truth admits that the smile was real and so was the sadness, that the ease was learned, not innate, that silence can be both shield and weapon, that avoiding pain does not mean transcending it, it means passing it forward, invisibly. And perhaps that is the final reckoning this story offers. Not condemnation, but clarity. Because when myths are left unchallenged, they teach future generations the wrong lessons. They suggest that survival means shrinking the self, that safety comes from not caring too much, that if you play the role well enough, the system will love you back. But the system never loves. It uses. It rewards. And when it no longer needs you, it lets you drift into legend, clean, smooth, unbothered. Dean Martin became immortal by never forcing the world to look at itself. And that is why the world still refuses to look at him too closely. So the question lingers, unresolved and sharp. How many truths are we willing to bury just to keep our icons comfortable? Legends may fall, but their truth always rises.